Hi, this is Susan from Fruit Frugal, and today I'm going to show you how to weld text so that it appears as a single image rather than individual images. And I'm going to start by showing you this monogram script font. Now this is an image from the Silhouette Design Store. This is actually an image and not a font. You can tell what are fonts because in the Silhouette library, anything that you purchase from the store that is an actual font will show up here under the My Fonts folder. But if it's here in your recent downloads or any of the others, it's actually an image. And so for this one, oh, sorry, that's the wrong letter. With this one, it's an actual letter, and so to use this and to create a monogram from these letters, you have to first ungroup the letter. And I'm doing this by right-clicking over the image. When my image is selected or my pointer is over the image and I see the hand, I can right-click with my mouse button. If you're on a Mac and do not have the right click button, you'll hold down your control key and then click. So on Mac, it's a control click anytime I say right click on this. But for Windows users, you're just going to right click and get this menu option. You can then ungroup the images for each of the images. You'll want to ungroup them. And you can see as I ungroup them, it will put a box around each of the individual images in that group. They are currently all selected, so if I were to move or delete one, they all move and interact. So I'd have to click off of it and then click back on in order to select that image. Okay, so I'm going to right click and again ungroup the image. So to use this with monograms, the center initial is always the initial of the last name, and the initials on the right side is the initial of the first name, and the initial on the left side is the initial of the first name, and the initial of on the right side is the initial of the middle name or maiden name if you don't have a middle name and you're married. So in these particular cases, once I have these three images, then I can move them around, and I do want them to overlap. With this particular image set, I don't like that my first and middle initials are a little bit smaller, so I'm going to make those a little bit bigger. I just held down my shift key and clicked on the image to select them both because I want them resized proportionally, and I'm just going to make them a little bit bigger. And so then I care about where my image overlaps. And when I'm overlapping my image, I pay attention to these little overlapping sections because those can kind of cut out funky if they're too small. And so I don't want to create too much of a gap there with those sections. And so once I have these images placed and my overlap in a way that I like and it's evenly spaced and so forth, then I want to select all of my images and weld them together. Now this is kind of easier to see if I fill the color, and I explain this to you with fill color. But right now, how Silhouette Studio sees these three images is it sees them as three separate images. Okay, so they're three separate individual images whose lines intersect and overlap. And we don't want those intersections to happen, because if we were to cut this all out of one colored vinyl, wherever they intersect and overlap, you're going to have little tiny pieces that are cutting apart. And especially with vinyl, those little tiny pieces can lift up. So once they're filled with color, you can kind of see this better, but I select all of my images. In this case, I just clicked somewhere off my image. I'm holding down my left mouse button and I'm dragging across over all of the images, and that selects everything in that lassoed area. So then I'm going to right click again on a Mac, it's Control click, and then I select weld, and those all join together. And if I take away the color, you can now see that these intersecting lines are gone. And see, this is what I was talking about, is how those overlap, because you have these little tiny pieces in here and how they fill. And let's zoom in, you can kind of see that these little tiny pieces are going to cut. So I would probably redo this particular image and maybe make my S and B a little bit smaller, larger, and play around with that so that didn't happen. But this is the best case scenario of what happens when you weld, okay? That you would click all the images and just hit weld, and all the pieces that are supposed to be there weld together. Now sometimes that doesn't always work, and that can depend on the font that you're using and how the designer created the font, or it can change if you've somehow changed your image and manipulated your image. And I'll show you this with another type of way to create monogram fonts. Is you use one of the monogram fonts from the Silhouette Design Store that were created specifically for monograms. In this case, I'm using the Monogram Script font, and I'll go ahead and make this bigger so that you can see this. Oops, not that big. That's 102 beneath. Hold on, let's try that again. Okay, so that did not have my S. Let's try that again. All right, there we go. So sorry about that. So now I have all of this together, and I want to change the spacing. Now, a lot of times people will say, I want to change my font and change it, and I made it, and now I can no longer change the font, and I'm not sure what happens. Whenever you're in image mode, you cannot change any of the properties of the font. And image mode is where you have this gray box that has the number on the bottom and on the right with a green circle at the top. This is image mode. For font mode, you have to double click and be in this green box with the blinking cursor and this blue line over on the right. Now, if you haven't kicked it permanently out of font mode, you can still highlight your text and make the changes that you want. This font doesn't really have these kind of things, but you could underline it, I guess, if you wanted to. Or you could change your spacing and how that works. Now, in this particular case, I don't know if you can really tell this, but it's more like the K and the E move over the S and the S stays stable. And I'm not really sure if I like that, you know, how that works. This is actually easier to see. I was helping someone the other day who's, instead of an E, they had an F. And so the way the F and the S were kind of overlapping and looking, it looks like this F is a little bit further. And so she wanted to manipulate how that changed and move that out of there. And so to do that, you'd have to release the compound path in order to do this. And so that can play a part in things, because once you release the compound path, you kick it out of font mode. And if you were to try and alter this or double click on it to go back into the font mode, what happens instead is you get these edit points, because when you double click on an image, you get the edit menu, edit points menu. Whereas before, when it was a font and you double clicked, it was in font mode. So you can't really change that, how that particular functionality works. And so if, again, you want to manipulate the font, and use the font characteristics, you have to do that while it's in font mode. But once you release the compound path, then you change how it works. And this one is hard to see because of how close some of this stuff connects, overlaps, I guess is the word I'm looking for. So let's go to another image that I've created. And here I've created my name out of the Aphrodite Slim font. This is a font that I've downloaded from the internet. And it has all these fun little swashes and swirls. And so when I'm in font mode again, I can make changes and choose different aspects of what I wanted to be. I could play and see if this S is looking any different in any of the different variations of this font. And yeah, I don't like how that really overlaps. So maybe I do. Maybe I want to play with that and see that, okay? But because I have this and I want to change it now, my spacing is really funky in here, and I wouldn't ever want to cut this and have this look as this does. So I'm going to have to kick it out of font mode, and I would do that by releasing the compound path. And once I've released the compound path, you may also have to ungroup to see the inner and outer parts of the letters. And let me just go back a step here before I release the compound path. Gotta go back another step. Okay, so before I release the compound path, let's fill this with color and you can see what I'm talking about. So when it's a compound path, the center of the image is going to fill with a color, meaning that area that's compounded by the two lines is going to fill with color. But if I were, in fact, to release the compound path on this, you could see how that fill changes, okay? And that's because these inside pieces and outside pieces are no longer connected, and it's not looking at that pathway between them, but it's looking as each separate part is its own image, okay? For example, this center part is now this part filled with color as well as that part filled with color. So if I wanted to change, if I want to move my font and move these letters and overlap them and change how they are, I do have to first release the compound path on them. That's the step one, is to release the compound path, okay? Hold on, I gotta select all of these and remove the color because that's gonna be easier to see. But if I want to weld these together and weld these two letters together, when I selected these, if I left it as is and I wanted to weld this E and this U together, if I did that while it was not a compound path, the center of my E disappears. And so that's kind of problematic. I don't like that. I want that center of the E to be there. So in order to avoid that, I have to first go through to any of my letters that have inside and outer parts or little loopies and squirrels, and I have to select all of those parts and make them a compound path. With this, sometimes the way they overlap, it's easier to not try and lasso them, but to click on the individual images. So to select more than one image, you just hold down the Shift key, and then I click on the actual line of the image that I'm trying to select. And I can see, here's this gray box, and I see these two different gray boxes, and I can see these pieces. And sometimes you really want to zoom in to kind of see, you know, what it is you're selecting. This is the same with either a Mac or a Windows-based computer, as you hold down the Shift key and click on the multiple parts of the image to select those. Once those multiple parts are selected, again, my hand pointer is a hand over the center of the image. I can then right-click and I can make it a compound path. And now, when it's a compound path, I can then weld these two images together by right-clicking, selecting both, right-clicking, and hitting weld. And now these two have welded together, and I have the center of my image. If I want to put my S over here and weld it, maybe I want to tip my S a little bit, because if I leave my S over here and then scoot it close together, the way they touch here, I don't really like that. So if I can kind of maybe tip that a little bit and move that over just a scoochy bit, and then I can select both parts that I want to weld, right click and weld, and now those are connected. Okay, so for my S, I have to select these different parts, and let me zoom out so that you can see that. Because my whole S goes way over here, my box is going to extend this far. That doesn't mean all of these letters are selected. If they were, you would see the individual boxes around those. And if you're ever confused, just clicking on them and seeing what boxes select when you click on that part of the line is going to give you an indication of that. But with this S, we want to select all of the parts. Again, right click and make compound path. I don't think my S's and the rest of it is going to connect to this S very well, but I want to kind of make sure my spacing is kind of similar to what it is between these other letters, and so I'm going to scooch that over. You could turn on your grid and use your grid line to line it up. I don't like the visual noise of the grid, and right now, because I'm not doing this for real, I'm just leaving this off so you can see a little bit better. All right, so let's select these parts of the A, and let's do that. Actually, with this A, before I forget, I don't like how thin this line is, and so if I wanted to change that, I could actually make this box a little bit smaller, this little part of the image a little bit smaller, and move that over, and that actually is thickening my line a little bit so that this has some weight to it when I cut. If I were to cut this out of vinyl, this thin little line is going to be very, very thin. And so I can go ahead and change that by making these a little bit smaller. If you're trying to move them and you can't move it as accurately with your mouse as you want to, you can use the arrows on your keyboard, and that will adjust your images up and down. So I could play with that here and just again make those a tiny bit smaller, and that gives me a little bit more thickness. So now when I select all of these and right click, I make compound path. My N and my A are not going to connect up here very well. That's just the nature of this font. If it were a TrueScript font, it might kind of come over that, and I could kind of do that and weld these two together. And then where this point comes in, we could kind of zoom in here. And I could double click on this now and go in and edit the point and make that a little bit, clean that up a little bit, and make that a little bit nicer there. It just is a preference thing as to what you like. I don't know that I really care about that, and I really actually kind of like it separate. But it depends on what I'm putting it on and where it's going to be. I don't really... I'm not a huge fan of how that is, but we'll leave it there for now and play with that. Again, I would have paid attention to this over here, so let's just go ahead and we'll go back a few steps. Whenever you do something, if you want to undo it, this little undo option is good. A keyboard shortcut for that is to right click, or I'm sorry, Control Z as in zebra will also take you back steps. So it just goes back one step at a time. So do that. So I wouldn't do that. So let's go here, and maybe you'd have to play with this, because this thing, you know, if you overlap it too much, it's gonna disappear, and how that does that. But maybe I like that disappearing. Maybe I don't necessarily need that whole little swoopy part of it. So I'm going to make sure it's inside my letter there. And then again, I'm going to try and maintain the same spacing here, but pay attention to how these are overlapping. So now that I have all all three of these images. Holding down my shift key, I'm going to click on my A, my N, and my S, and right click and weld. And now they're all one big thing. Oh, hey, that actually looks kind of cool. So I could do all of that. They're welded together. I can select the two different images and again, make them a compound path and then fill with color. Now, whether I made them a compound path or not wouldn't matter. They still would have filled with color correctly because of how these parts were welded and that this one was already a compound path. But you can see on there that now you're getting some better just some better how they weld, and you have the inside and outside of your letters and do that. So that is how you weld and get those to do that without the center of your letters disappearing. My name is Susan. I'm from FruFrugal.com. That's FROUFRUGAL. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments and I'll be happy to answer them. Thanks and have a great day.